Anne Ackermann is one of the co-founding members of Ukraine's key environmental NGO, the Centre for Environmental Initiatives Ecoaction, and a professional in the field of energy and the environment with experience in NGOs as well as the energy design and research sectors in Eastern and Central Europe. Her main areas of expertise include energy efficiency in buildings, renewable energy, climate change mitigation, and policy advocacy. Between 2016 and 2018, she managed the Expert Energy Policy Reform Group of Ukraine's largest civil society platform, the Reanimation Package of Reforms. Anna is a policy analyst for the Green Reconstruction of Ukraine at the IISD. Anna, welcome to the channel.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
And this is one of the unusual circumstances where I've actually met you in real life before doing the podcast. Normally it's the other way around. So we've already had, I think, some really interesting conversations. And the trigger for today's conversation was actually seeing you at an event run by the Ukrainian Institute in London. What has changed since there? Because we were very worried a couple of weeks ago that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant could be the next example of ecocide or environmental terrorism that Russia inflicts.
Well, there hasn't been much change in there. Of course, we all are, I wouldn't say expecting, but we understand that indeed the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant can be the next target for Russia. And this is clearly stated now by Ukrainian president, the government, and repeated many times per day, I would say. So we do, well, what do? We now try to do everything in Ukraine to make sure that the consequences of the Kakhovka Dam disaster are felt as little as possible by the population, which is probably impossible because it becomes an international disaster. And well, trying to prevent also in any ways possible the possible next large environmental catastrophe at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Understanding now that Russia is really capable of anything. It's actually interesting how we are still being surprised that Russia can be doing, very bad things after everything we've seen already by now. But it looks like after the Kakhovka Dam destruction, which actually is the largest environmental catastrophe for Ukraine in decades. Now we do kind of understand that it could get even worse.
And I've addressed this in a couple of interviews, but I think you're uniquely placed to comment on this because you interact with the media, you're an expert in the field. There's two problems, I think, with the media coverage. One is the short-term coverage. It didn't get the kind of clarity and real emphasis on the immediate aftermath. And there was a whole two sides kind of game going on in the media, which sort of reduced the impact of this man-made intentional catastrophe. Terrorist act. I mean, it's quite clear to label a terrorist act, but the media held off from labeling it as such. That's the short-term problem in media coverage. Then there's the longer-term problem because the environmental implications on agriculture, land, on the many villages and lifestyles that are affected, as well as unique ecosystems. These are the sort of longer-term effects, and the media isn't particularly good at covering drawn-out long-term impacts. But as you're an expert in the field, I wanted your take on that, and of course to discuss what those long-term impacts might actually be.
Well, there is a lot to talk about, and indeed, as far as the media coverage is concerned, I think we are really looking at what's happening in Ukraine already. First of all, media is getting tired, and probably this is one of the reasons why the coverage was so low. Although for Ukraine, this was a big deal, right? And at the same time, there is actually so much damage already done that Kakhovka, it is the largest damage again to the environment done so far, but it also depends how you categorize this, because well, at Ecoaction we've been tracking damages to the environment and the cases of damages to the environment since February 24th last year, and in public sources we already discovered more than 1,000 of such different cases of damages to the environment, and they've arrived from forest fires caused by basically shooting and shelling, to pollution of waters, to pollution of soils. And here, of course, we actually will experience many negative environmental consequences all at the same time, such as water pollution and soil pollution, and the absence of fresh water for huge territory, no irrigation, and so on. However, I think the Kachovka case is especially, it's a different story, and we have to look also at it from the historical perspective. It's absolutely disastrous what actually has happened. And we understand that it should have never happened. Like, no one should have ever done, and it is an international crime, it is a war crime. And at the same time, the way the Kachovka Dam was actually built during the Soviet times, that was also a crime in itself. Because it was the Stalinist idea that to build this dam, the only goal to build the dam, of course, was the economic profits and the irrigation for the region. But the idea was to tame nature and to show the human power over the nature. Lots of houses were back then destroyed. People were left without homes and almost without warning. They just had to leave very quickly. And yeah, the dam destroyed everything, and also the dam destroyed Ukraine's unique history and heritage, because our Cossacks were living there for centuries. And now we actually rediscovering the remains of very old boats, which may date 1,000 years, you know. So it's kind of absolutely amazing, just mind-blowing to see this sort of things happening. And many environmentalists are now saying that, you know, the disaster, the dam was not even supposed to be there in the first place. But then, of course, it was not supposed to be then destroyed. But as it's already happened that way, perhaps we should leave it be and try to restore what we actually had, because again, those areas are very important for Ukraine. But this is the conversation we may have with you also later on, because it connects directly to how Ukraine will be actually rebuilding, with what kind of ideas. And definitely in terms of the long-term consequences, I mean, we can talk about many. One of the things that we know for sure is that the hydropower plant, the Kachovka hydropower plant, it had more than 150,000 tons of oil there. So we have oils basically in the water. We have dead bodies of animals. We have nature protected areas, absolutely, you know, flooded and without possibility to return them, some unique species that may die out and so on. You can definitely find that out there. And indeed, the media, I hope the media would actually be covering this, because it's a long-term perspective. And also from the perspective of that does not only touch Ukraine, because in the end, all of the polluted waters, they actually go all in the Black Sea. And the Black Sea, it's not Ukraine's sea. You know, it's the sea of many countries. So others would also feel this effects of this destruction. And yeah, we can really see that now actually some of the media are coming back to that, so it's good. I see some big media are talking about it, but of course we can only expect that as Ukraine's struggle and the Russia's aggression is now viewed a bit like a Star Wars movie from when you look at it from abroad, you only wait for the next big disaster to happen. But this is the kind of feeling that Ukrainians have. And this is very unfortunate, because everything we need to be doing is actually to try to avoid the next disaster and to finally win and to finally start rebuilding. This is and live in peace, of course. So this is the big idea.
And I think that will come to reconstruction, because the concept of victory and the fact that some people will try to put limits on that, and of course it's in Russia's interest to freeze the conflict, and that has a big impact on reconstruction, fund stability, and so on. But let's turn back to the dam, because I think the eco-terrorism aspect is an interesting one here. And as you say, why people are shocked every time it happens when perhaps they ought not to be. It seems that not just since the full-scale war, but actually over the last couple of decades, Russia has shown that it can weaponize anything and everything, whether that be light, fuel, heat, water, everything is a potential weapon. We know that gas, when the gas was switched off during the Ukrainian winter, that is a form of terrorism or blackmail as well. So none of this should be a huge surprise. And you mention a sort of over 1,000 documented ecological catastrophes on various scales as a direct consequence of the war. And because Russia started the war, they are culpable for everything. But how many out of these ecological sort of issues that are being logged, how many of them do you think are intentional, are this sort of ecological bomb that Russia has been using, or how many of them are sort of unintended consequences of the invasion?
This is something that we actually discovered last year. I was telling how we started documenting damages to the environment, and we very soon reached, many hundreds. And what we thought that with all of that information, and of course we saw that other organizations started doing also similar things, also collecting this information about all of this huge damages to the environment done. We thought all of that could go to international courts in the end, and in litigation, and to make Russia pay. This was the idea, right? And then we actually discovered that internationally, to have anything to be proved as an environmental crime, it had actually to be proved to be intentional. So it means that whatever kind of damages is done to the environment, it has to be done with an intention to do the damage to the environment, not to the other side of the conflict, not to destroy a particular facility, but actually to make the damage to the environment. And this is kind of almost impossible to prove. And perhaps the Kakhovka Dam destruction, this is where the possibility of actually proving this may be found. So we will see if that will be possible. With everything else, it looks like, if you look from afar, from the perspective of international jurisdiction, it looks like it's just a part of a normal, let's say, part of a conflict. Because you always have, oil depots exploding and with the black fumes. We were shocked to see that for the first time. We thought, oh my God, this is air pollution, but also what would people be breathing and so on. But then destruction of the tanks, and then the pollution by heavy metals of the soils and so on. That is a part of any war on this planet. So it is complicated. However, again, returning to the Kakhovka Dam story, is that with this, and I think this is the important part to tell now, the international community starts coming back to the concept of ecocide, and demanding that the ecocide could also be one of the international crimes reviewed by an international criminal court. For now, there is 4, and environmental crimes are not part of these international legislation. So they can be considered as crimes. So environmental crimes can be in part considered as a crime against humanity, but it's not that direct. So if we would have actually environmental crimes also there, but ecocide specifically, that would help a lot. And there is a whole movement actually where they lawyers who already proposed the text of what ecocide could be. And more than that, Ukraine in its national legislation already has definition of ecocide. And we definitely see that with the Kakhovka Dam, it's definitely the ecocide committed by Russia. Of course, it would need to go to the court and so on, but it does look like a very strong legal case. So hopefully with what's happening to Russia, we may be able to push the international community to finally act on this. And hopefully that would also help other countries to deal with not only conflict situations, not only wars and environmental damages during the wars, but also anything starting from consequences of climate change to biodiversity destruction and so on. So this could actually be also a tool, a mechanism that could be used even in peacetime. We'll see if that works. There is, I think, again, there is this momentum that is now gained or regained with the Kakhovka Dam destruction. And it will be also important for Ukraine, because if that mechanism is in place, we will have one extra tool to actually, again, have Russia pay. And why it is important to pay for the damages to the environment, because actually it's very difficult to calculate the damages, to put a price tag on them. it's easy to say, okay, there is no forest anymore. Well, let's replant the forest. How much would that cost approximately, you know, and to try to kind of put a price. But what about all of the species that would not be there anymore? What about all of the indirect impacts on the population with the, for example, impact on health, pressure on the national health system through the polluted water, polluted soils, and so on? These are all indirect losses, so you have to actually have some methodology to be able to calculate that, include that in this price, because these are these long-term damages we started to discuss about, right? So it's not, of course, only about directly environment. It also actually impacts the humans and all of the next generations.
Yeah. I'll come back to that, because I think there's two sort of questions that arise from that. We'll come back to that one in a minute, because I think that's a huge question, and it's one that possibly can't be put within that framework. But the first one is that I think, a comment one of my guests last week made was that Ukraine, we've been framing the narrative Ukraine's fighting for survival, for its land, for its people, against genocide and so on. And the speaker made a point that Ukraine is fighting for a lot more. You're fighting for universal values. These aren't just benefits to Ukraine and its people, they are, but you're fighting for universal values which are, inherent to the European and British lifestyle, the Western lifestyle. And when you frame this idea of new legislation around ecocide, again, it frames it that Ukraine is suffering directly, but what you're fighting for are a universal set of values that would then apply to other conflicts and other regions of the world and actually progress civilization forward.
I do think it is, yeah, it's exactly what you were saying. But also, if you look at the most recent surveys, just like a week ago, I talked with the researchers at the Swiss Institute who did the survey asking people in Switzerland and in Ukraine about their view of the dangers of climate change, how important was for them the nature protection, transition to cleaner energy solutions and so on. And it was fascinating actually to see that the numbers were practically the same. There was not much difference. So let's say more than 70% of Swiss do care about climate change. They consider something should be done about it. The same number of Ukrainians would think the same. Even in times of work, this was a very recent survey, right? And it also feels for us, for people who work in the environmental sector, that now people feel as strong as never that they actually need to protect the environment because they see all of these consequences of the war and of destruction happening around them. So they understand how important things are, and these are very concrete things. This is the clean water, clean soils, the forests, everything that was around them is not there anymore. So this comes together in one picture. And when we talk about actually climate change, and I think here it's also a very strong message that Russia is financing this war through basically exports of their fossil fuels. And all of the discussions about, trying to do everything to prevent climate change, 1.5 degrees warming, and so on. Yes, of course, it's hard for many people to comprehend what does this actually mean. But we all know that fossil fuels are causing climate change. And we definitely see how the fossil fuels, in the end, transform into weapons that kill people. And this is why it's important to finally, and I mean, we actually see the actions taken by many countries already since last year. They understood that it's important to speed up the energy transition because of this. Let's say thanks to Russia. And hopefully this will be a good trend. And also hopefully this will be a good trend to rebuild Ukraine. Because rebuilding Ukraine with fossil fuels will look strange if you look at the cause of this war.
Yeah, we'll come to that in a minute, the fuel balance and, of course, nuclear plays a very important part in the balance of energy in Ukraine at the moment. And obviously demand for electricity is a lot lower at the moment than it is during peacetime. There's millions of people abroad and many cities even without sort of fuel. But the question I wanted to come to, I think, is about sustainability of territories, because at the moment these conversations are going on about rebuilding Ukraine. And to an extent, they're based on the assumption that Ukraine will regain all, most, or if not all, of its legal territories. And that would include Donbass. And of course, the maximalist aims would include Crimea as well. But with the Kakhovka Dam explosion and the destruction of infrastructure, there has to be there's a sort of elephant in the room, isn't there? Which is that certain regions that have been devastated, especially the eastern region and Crimea, it may be very difficult using standard economic logic to rebuild those areas. It may be that the rebuilding and re-energizing the economy happen far faster in the Western territories that have also, suffered less damage. How should Ukraine get around that? And actually, does that question need to be openly discussed? Whether a depopulation of certain areas is an inevitable outcome of the destruction that's taken place?
I think this is one of the most complicated questions we would have. Well, we will not only have to be thinking about in some time, but I already start thinking about now. We have the Ministry for Restoration now that is working on certain methodologies already, thinking about how to prioritize reconstruction projects, because Ukraine is fighting Russia while rebuilding at the same time. It's very hard to actually prioritize already, find a proper methodology. But imagining once all the territories are back, Ukraine restores its territorial integrity. So Donetsk, Luhansk regions are back, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Crimea, and the level of devastation will be dramatic. So we discussed about Kakhovka Dam, right? And actually, in many sources you can find information about all the damages made since 24th of February last year. But what about all of the damages done to the eastern regions of Ukraine since 2014? These are absolutely horrific. And the researchers who are actually trying to look at those, they did not have access to those territories. So almost no one did, right? And why am I talking about this? Because the eastern Ukraine is this huge industrial territory, the heritage also, let's say, of not only Soviet times, but even pre-Soviet times, with lots of coal and metal, and the cities who were built around that, around big industries. And we have lots of coal mines, which since 2014 were flooded with all of the toxic water and pollution that came out of that. They are flooded because it's actually very expensive to pump out the water, which you have to do when you properly close the mine or you don't take care of it. It's very expensive. So Russia did not want to spend a single cent on that. So we have flooded coal mines, and we have lots of facilities, industrial facilities abandoned with also lots of pollution. We don't even know what's happening there. So once we see that, we come back there, we would be actually asking, do we even want to do anything with all of that pollution? Do we actually have resources to do that? And I think it's very important to look at the Ukraine Recovery Conference that happened in London just in June this year, right? Where actually we met with you within also this events happening around this conference. Most of the discussions were around private sector investments or international support for Ukraine reconstruction and so on. But who would pay for all of the damages done to the environment? And we actually talking, according to the estimates of Ukrainian Ministry for Environment Protection, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars of damages to the environment. This is not something that could bring money because it's not a business case. So who would pay for rehabilitation of those lands if ever? So, and especially well, this is what we have started from, right? To prioritize. How do you prioritize between helping to build up the cities where you have lots of internally displaced persons? They need to have economic activity, infrastructure for them, and so on. And between these indeed abandoned areas in the east, and then between also managing all of these consequences of the Kakhovka Dam disaster in the south and trying to adapt the agriculture to the new realities, find solution to get the fresh water and so on. And I think it makes sense, at least from my perspective, it would make sense to think about people first, to look at the human side, to make sure that people live in the better environment, better infrastructure, but also healthily where they are. And indeed, if some territories are left abandoned for generations, that may totally happen in Ukraine.
And an example could be there the trade-off between, say, looking at Azovstal, the vast steel plant that formed part of a critical battle that held Russian forces at bay, in Mariupol. It's going to be a difficult equation, isn't it? Because if you were to invest a certain amount of money, it could be, billions, if not tens of billions, as you say, into high-tech industries. They could scale very quickly at a very high margin. They're not dependent on a single area. People can even work remotely, and those are sort of very viable. Whereas you take that money and put it into, let's say, cleaning up and then rebuilding, massive steelworks. The margins on those kind of products internationally are very low anyway, and there's huge international competition. It wouldn't be as attractive to a private investor to do that, whereas invest somewhere where there's high returns. So if that plant hadn't been destroyed, then maybe it would still be an attractive investment opportunity, but not in the state it's at. And that's going to be a real problem for most of heavy industry, because not only do you have to rebuild the plants, you might actually have to clean up a lot of toxic waste first.
Well, absolutely, you're right. And it would definitely be for investors much easier to actually build up somewhere where you don't have to clean up, right? Where the government, which is looking there in that direction already, they want to provide as much, as favorable conditions as possible for any investments in Ukraine at the moment. And it makes sense when the economy is going down. How do you have to deal with the situation. You have to make sure that you return to at least some normal. But also in London, actually, the Ukraine Recovery Conference, our government was presenting big numbers in possible GDP growth, in expected GDP growth of Ukraine. And of course, it makes sense that Ukraine has the huge potential. It will depend where we move. Indeed, cleaning up some territories would be a big deal. But then what is also as important, is a part of your question too, is where Ukraine would be moving to, which type of the economy. For the moment, we've been largely a resource base for Europe, for the West, actually for many countries out of the West too, right? With our agriculture products and food exports, but also raw steel and iron that was actually exported, and then it was transformed into the steel according to the EU standards, but already somewhere in Italy, right? So the plans were there while Ukraine was doing the dirty job at all of these very old factories, like typically the Azovstal. And what the government is now suggesting is that all of those things that we're exporting that were not necessarily done to the top-notch best standards in the world, those will become much better. So Ukraine could actually be competitive, maybe also in the field of steel, but that would be a green steel. This is what the government is saying, that they want. They see Ukraine as a green hub, producing green steel, perhaps green hydrogen, green ammonia, and so on. And I think it's a good idea. At the same time, it's still based a lot about who Ukraine has been, for decades. And we are still like in some sort of transformative thinking. But do we actually want to keep all of that? It makes sense because the business groups who are working there, they're already there, the largest ones, but do we actually want to add up something new? at the same time becoming some kind of an energy green hub, that would make sense. It's just that we should not only focus on exports, but also to see what kind of products we can be producing in Ukraine for the Ukrainian market, which will be very big, especially for rebuilding the country, for reconstruction. And we could definitely be, and this part of the government's ideas I actually really like, that Ukraine, for example, could be producing some of the equipment that now everybody needs in the world, maybe solar PV panels, maybe wind turbines, maybe heat pumps, isolation materials, and so on. And that would make us unique. So not just be sending abroad all of the raw materials that we have, but actually to producing, products much higher in the value chains, where Ukraine would become an equal partner with other countries. But here we would have to be actually fighting for investments, even with Poland, who at the moment has all of the best conditions you can even imagine, right, for this kind of investment. So how do we actually achieve that? And this is a very big question. And of course, managing this and at the same time making sure that people, the Ukrainians, come back home and that they actually would be inspired to come back to this Ukraine with a new vision, new thinking, who could be working in this sort of new industries, facilities, and so on. This will be kind of, we have many questions, many complicated questions to intelligence to solve. But at the same time, I think we are moving in the right direction. Well, let's see what next year at the recovery conference the big vision would be. The ideas are already, some ideas are already there. That's for sure.
And I think one thing people have seen through this conflict, one thing that really has landed for those who observe it, is that Ukrainians have proven to be very innovative. In the way they organize, definitely, and maybe you have to really be a Ukraine watcher to see the sort of behaviors there in teams and so on. But people have seen, almost everyone will have seen the footage of drones being adapted, technology being adapted, of Ukrainians being able to take, dozens and dozens of different standards of Western military kit and somehow, training themselves in record time and bringing it all together into a sort of cohesive fighting force. Of course, there's going to be a little bit of propaganda that sort of papers over. There will always be mistakes, friendly fire, etc., and they've kept those stories very effectively out of the media. Nonetheless, I think everyone has been astounded by this innovative behavior of Ukrainians, and that bodes well for a sort of green, tech-driven, innovative economy.
I do agree with you, and there is also something more I would add to this the sparkle that Ukrainians have in themselves. They are very good. And this is something that really helped us actually go through the most challenging times in history. The people are very good when there is some risk, there to take the risk, and definitely not be dictated too much by someone what you're supposed to do, to go ahead yourself. And that comes, and I think this is very underlying big transformation that happened to Ukraine in the last 10 years, was the decentralization reform. And I really want to draw your attention to that and actually look at that, how it happened, because many say that this is something that actually helped Ukraine to go through the first weeks and the first months of Russia's invasion. This resilience, where did it come from? It came from the fact that since 2014, through this decentralization reform, the local communities, they received much more power, financial power also. There were transparent elections that happened, a few times during these 10 years, where the mayors were the people who were elected by the community, who had the trust of the community, who had time to show how they could transform the community through certain projects. And some of them actually became the heads of the territorial defense units when Russia started coming up from the north, for example. And people followed them, on the side. So it was, of course, we know the famous video with Zelensky, who said he was there together with the government. It was also important, and as important was the presence of the mayors, of the local governors also on the place, where everybody felt that they were, have the support. And so this resilience of Ukrainians, it's a lot about this, that locally they could act and locally they had this power, so they knew what it meant. And it's interesting also how things are changing and how they also showed up in different sectors through Russia's invasion. Within the same line. So Ukraine has this huge energy system that was built up in the Soviet times with huge hydropower plants. You know, we know now the Kakhovka Dam, but there were many along the Dnieper. We have 4 nuclear power plants who, before 24th of February, were producing half of all of the electricity in Ukraine. We have big thermal power plants and so on. And all of those, of course, became the main target of Russia's attacks the last autumn and winter. And at the same time, we saw how in the beginning of Russia's invasion, people who had solar panels on their roofs, or, for example, a solar cooperative in the north of Ukraine, in one of the cities near Chernobyl area, they could actually could still be producing some electricity and keep it running while the grid was out, because again, it was a target for Russia, the big grid connecting, you know, big stations and so on. And people already saw how actually renewables work. This is something that you produce just up there above your head, and then you consume it just there, right? And then you can call your neighbor to say in Kyiv to say, I'm fine, we are still standing. And that also proved, again, very important during this winter's attacks. And this also transformed into this way of thinking. What are these big systems where Russia shows actually what the nuclear energy terrorism could look like for the first time in history by occupying Europe's largest nuclear power plant. And at the same time, as a contrast, this resilience of the people and communities now who are asking to have solar stations with storages on the rooftops of their hospitals to make sure that they have enough electricity, to cover at least the basic needs for the critical infrastructure, because they know it works. This is this big change that happened. It's not even about innovation. This was your main topic of the question, but it was more about things that already are there today. And Ukraine kind of shows how they actually make sense, that how they can be used in probably not the most transformative ways, but they can be used differently. And I'm sure that many countries would actually follow Ukraine's example afterward.
I'll say, linking that idea of decentralization, of taking responsibility for your actions, you know, and your immediate environment, and then laddering that up with technology. I think these things are so intimately connected. So I'm really interested that you sort of made that sort of connection there. And I think Finland's a great example, because Finland has lived under the sort of threat of the USSR for many decades, since the Finnish War in the 1920s. And that sort of forced the Finns to become resilient, yes, but also to make sure they were self-sufficient in energy, food, and many other things, and, you know, distribute that authority and capability to defend local communities in case, you know, Russia invaded again. So I think great lessons there for Europe from both Ukraine and Finland, and also, you know, learning from the Finnish example, very effective. And of course, the Finns don't have too many natural resources, so they have to be very innovative in their economy, you know, how they create much more you know, sophisticated goods, manufactured goods, because the raw materials aren't there for the kind of extraction economy that of course we know Russia is, and which leads sometimes to extremely authoritarian governments. But there are certain things, as you were saying earlier, that individuals just probably cannot deal with, and these are some of the immediate aftermath of the war. So do you expect there to be international support for things like demining, cleaning up the disturbed soil, say in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and then all the sort of unexploded ordnance, the shells, the casings, the heavy metals, that kind of obvious fallout from the war? Is that an area Ukraine is seeking international support, expertise, and funding to help clean up?
Definitely, and demining, of course, the basic need. And even though the reconstruction conference, you know, big conference with many governments, it was about rebuilding Ukraine, it was about, you know, the future plans. but we were still discussing demining because it is the basic need to actually restart anything, restart the life, restart the economy. And we are talking about huge territories that would need to be demined. So indeed, we heard from the international community, that Switzerland also provided quite a big chunk of money for demining for Ukraine and other countries. So this is discussed. So indeed, as far as demining is concerned, this is the most basic thing that Ukraine needs to rebuild anything and to return lives back. And even though this large conferences in June was all about, of course, reconstruction and big ideas for the coming years, for the future of Ukraine, demining was discussed. Some countries pledged quite a big support already to help Ukraine demine. We are talking about enormous territories. And of course, some of them, for example, again, in the north of Ukraine, where Russian forces just stayed for 1 month, but they brought the amount of damage, it was just mind-blowing. And again, the mines all over the place, in forests and everywhere. So we need to, again, to make sure that all of that is cleaned up, and then to be also managing more territories in the south, in the east, and so forth. So this is the basics, and there is international support. I cannot say how sufficient that is. I only know for sure that in terms of money, the government knows better probably, but we know for sure that it will take years and years to demine everything, or not even everything, because some of the mines that were now released in the flow with the Kakhovka Dam explosion too. Some of those mines that end up in the Black Sea, who knows what's going to happen to them? They may end up just at the bottom of the sea, and who knows, may bring actually some destruction later on. But in any case, as far as other things are concerned and damages to the environment, and if there's international support, I think we need another big conference to actually discuss this, because this was not really a topic, but I haven't heard much about it those few weeks ago. It was more about the private investments, international engagement, how to provide security guarantees for the businesses who would come to Ukraine. These are all important. However, indeed, the things we're discussing with you today, they are as important, again, because they have an impact on not only on the bird species nature, but on humans. And some of the examples you showed also with Azovstal, with Mariupol, who would be cleaning things up? This is a very big question indeed. And yeah, we can also think about Chernobyl also as a good example of basically the absence of understanding of Russians, what they're actually even doing. When they came to Ukraine, they started digging the trenches, right, in the Chernobyl area, to then get radiation to be sent to Belarus for treatment. These people don't even sometimes, I think, even understand. I guess the highest command understand what's happening, so they probably don't care about their people. This is something that we see generally speaking, and they definitely don't care about Ukrainians. Well, as little. But then again, Ukraine has to then manage all of the consequences, and this is why, looking at what they did in Chernobyl, we can only hope. But then not only hope. I think here we also have to act and do everything possible. The Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, I don't even want to pronounce it, that nothing will happen there. So let's keep it running. The International Atomic Energy Agency, maybe they just have to be living there with their whole staff to make sure that nothing. No, they are already based there. They do some rotations. Maybe their head should spend even more time there. But we really, considering Russia breached all of the international treaties possible, we have to find all of the ways to prevent even larger damages.
And this is actually a talk I'm going to give you a heads up that I'm going to be having in a couple of weeks, and that's with an expert on the international atomic industry. And actually, Rosatom has barely been sanctioned at all, and that's one of the great mysteries of the sanctions regime. And if we want Russia to not go ahead and destroy the Zaporizhia power plant, then we have this ideal lever which could be to heavily sanction Rosatom and say, well, if you do this, then you're done on the international atomic energy industry. But again, I'm not sure there's the real focus of world leaders. That wasn't going to be the question. That's just a heads up that we're gonna hit that topic, because I think it's crucially important. The last topic really is everything you've talked about seems to be contingent on victory. So we have a huge number of people abroad. It's important they return. It's important they have inspiration. They come back to a country that has the funds to be rebuilt. All of these things seem to me contingent, including the foreign confidence, the foreign funds. They're all contingent on Ukraine actually regaining all of its territories and not having any frozen conflict, any doubt. It's total victory, or many of these things may not actually happen.
Yes, you're absolutely right. There is many, many challenges, and everything is indeed about the outcomes. And I think that even though you probably have very different audience, people who listen to this podcast today, they're probably also curious to learn more about Ukraine. And I think one of the absolutely inspiring things that I see, and what also keeps me running, is how civil society in Ukraine works during these times, and also how Ukrainian cities are working. They are doing amazing things. They still keep planning cities still keep planning their future, developing sustainable action plans, looking for investments during the wartime. They do all of their best, and everything that I always feel like we need to support them. Definitely, we need to give them everything, because these people are, the heroes. And at the same time, civil society, and we have now some of the civil society organizations who are also supporting the army and fundraising millions of dollars from basically the population, but also from Ukrainian businesses and everything. It just doesn't exist anywhere in the world. So with these people, I think it will be impossible to lose, because these people are all aimed for the victory. And they are rebuilding. And as the mayor of the city of Trostanes, that was occupied by Russian forces for the first month of the invasion, it's in the Sumy region, and he said, we already rebuilt, because everything was looted by Russians. Just almost not a single shop or administrative building was left with computer. Like, everything was looted. But they say they already restored 60% of all of the destroyed facilities, and just give them 1.5 years, they will be done. This is just to show you the level of belief of people in themselves, also in the country. 95% of the population returned to the city already, which is only 35 kilometers from Russia, from Russian border. And the mayor says, we will be doing all of our best, to be here to support the economy, and the government and all of the national authorities. The only thing they should be thinking about is how to kick Russians out, basically, how to win this war. This is where we are. Everybody's thinking that way. So support for Ukraine, I think, has to be the matter of actually looking at them. I mean, it's inspiration, but it's a matter of European security, not only Ukrainian security. And it has to be clear that if Ukraine stays strong, and it has to be a strong economy, as we discussed, an equal partner with the EU, with the West. If it stays strong, then of course Russia would think twice or thrice to actually attack or not attack again. So this is where we are aiming. If we are weak, this will be repeating again and again and again. And Poland knows this for sure. Baltic countries know this for sure. So ask them if you don't trust us, because maybe something we're too emotional. So this is the idea. And of course, the underlying principle to actually be building this economy, to actually returning people home, is indeed the victory and the peace, and restoring territorial integrity of Ukraine. So here, whatever, there is so many ways actually to support Ukraine at the moment, to support civil society in Ukraine, who work on all the different topics. starting from environment to the social, humanitarian aspects and so on, but also Ukrainian cities, but also on the international level. If you work with Ecosite, this is what we discussed today, please try to have this topic again in the international agenda. Let's raise it and let's make sure that the ecocide is one of the international crimes and adopted by the UN and by all of the governments. So yeah, so there is a lot to do on all of the levels, and I'm sure this is our common fight for indeed very international values for humanity. So we really have to win together, because otherwise I really don't know then why anything else makes sense.
Well, I found this conversation inspiring. I thought it was going to be incredibly depressing, but actually it's quite the reverse. It's inspirational, and I think it gives us cause to hope that some, if not all of the things we've discussed will see progress. And I think most people watching this channel do believe in a full maximalist Ukrainian victory. And I think what you've been able to do today is to describe why that is so important, why all of these sort of progressions on the economy, the environment, fixing the horrific damage that Russia has inflicted are all dependent on victory. And of course, we know there are other things as well, including the return of refugees, the return of children who've been kidnapped. Many other things are contingent on this victory. So I wanted to say the work you're doing is extraordinary, and I'm so glad you could take an hour out to help us understand it better.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to discuss with you.